Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Iroshizuku Shin Ryoku. I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at some writing samples that I did on other types of paper. I'll compare Iroshizuku Shin Ryoku to other green inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Shin Ryoku came off the nib of my glass dip pen very quickly at the beginning. It seems to be a very flowy ink, but you have to look pretty closely because just at first glance, it looks pretty uniform. Even in the writing sample where I wrote the name of the ink, it looks pretty uniform, and it was very pleasant writing with this ink using the glass dip nib. The swatch that I made with tweezers was nice and crisp. Now on this Tomoe River paper, you can see it started out nice and dark and faded to a medium green maybe. But on some of the papers that I used, the swatch was just very unusually uniform. The drip at the end of the swatch has a very thin halo of red sheen, and in some of the heavier bits of writing, the letters have a halo of red sheen too, and with the lighting that I have right now, that's not really showing up. I'm going to begin with a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. If I were using a Hobonichi or a planner with similar small grids, I would use this pen. This extra fine nib was surprisingly smooth on this paper, very pleasant. I'm a person who enjoys fine nibs, but I don't use Japanese extra fine nibs. For normal writing, I just use this extra fine for testing inks, but I would be very willing to use this ink and nib combination for personal writing. And the legibility is very nice. I just love those crisp letters. Next, I'll be using my Sailor LeCool. It has a stainless steel medium fine nib. Again, this medium fine nib was very smooth, and I find that this medium fine nib writes probably closer to a fine nib. This particular nib, some inks, this nib is very unpleasant, and with others, like this ink, just it's like a completely different nib. It's very enjoyable, puts down a nice uniform line. It was very smooth. This particular nib works very well with the darker, more saturated Iroshizuku inks. This past semester, I came out of retirement and went back and taught full-time, and I used this pen and my new Kaweco Lilliput. I interchanged using those two pens, and I really enjoyed using this one with Iroshizuku Asagao. Asagao's an ink that I don't really use that often. It's a pretty blue, but it's a dark blue, which I tend to like, but it's got just a touch too much brightness to it. But something about the amount of ink that this put down, it brought out the darkness of the ink. I don't know, it looked really good, and it performed really well on my Rhodia paper that I was using it on. It was just a joy to use, and this also, I'm just loving the way the ink looks. I love the shade of green that I'm getting, and it just feels very pleasant. It's smooth and just the ink is nice and flowy. This ink and nib are well suited for each other. Next, I've got a Pilot Explorer. It has a stainless steel medium nib. This nib feels a bit drier than the Lacool. It doesn't look like it's drier, but maybe it's just because it's a slightly broader nib, though it doesn't look that much broader. It feels a little bit drier, but it doesn't feel dry to the point that it's unpleasant. It gives it a slight, just very slight chalky feeling. It's chalky, but still smooth. It's very pleasant. I've enjoyed using this Pilot Explorer medium nib on Filofax paper, which isn't known to be very fountain pen friendly, but it just felt so nice. And I have a feeling this would be a good ink to use on that Filofax paper. It feels pleasant. And even with it feeling a little bit dry, some inks, when it's a bit dry, the ink looks pale and washed out. And you can see up here, I was a little bit worried that the ink would look too pale, but it might be just a hair more pale than it is when writing with the Lacool, but it still looks very nice. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat fine nib. Now, this is very feedbacky, and I was kind of surprised by this because the ink looks very saturated. And so I was under the impression, since it felt fairly smooth in all these nibs, I was under the impression that the ink was pretty viscous. But I think this ink is flowy, but it's not very thick. So you really feel the nib on the paper, and that's why this Pilot Explorer, instead of feeling just glassy smooth, had a chalky feeling to it. And so in a nib that has feedback, you're going to feel it. Now, this particular nib, I probably wouldn't mind using it for journaling, like in my Some Lines a Day, where you just write 5 or 6 lines in your journal, or using it for a planner where you're just jotting down an appointment, not doing lengthy bits of writing, because the feedback was extreme, but not so extreme that you couldn't write just a little bit with it, especially on a smoother kind of paper. But for lengthy note taking, I feel like this is a little too much feedback even for me. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 74. It also has a 14 karat fine nib. Now, I had to see how the smooth Pilot fine nib compared to the Platinum feedbacky fine nib, and this was much smoother. I wouldn't really call it feedback, but you could feel the nib gripping the paper. I guess you could call it a velvetyness. So I would call this nice. And so this, no surprise, this Pilot fine nib performs really well with this Pilot ink. Next, I've got a Sailor 1911 Standard. It has a 14 karat medium nib. You can see this ink is pretty flowy. This medium nib is quite a bit wetter than the others, and I could really feel it as I was writing. It felt wet, especially on this Tomoe River paper. It was smooth in the sense that a Sailor medium nib can be smooth. It, had that feedback, but it was much smoother than the Platinum fine nib. Now, I feel like a Platinum medium nib would be just as smooth as this. The Platinum and the Sailor medium nibs have a similar kind of feedback. It's not the same, but usually, in my experience, if a ink performs well in one, it will perform well in the other. So again, I would call this nice, very pleasant. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Now, just like the Sailor, this flowy ink was nice and wet in this medium nib. I think these two medium nibs would be better suited for larger writing because they are so wet. But the Pilot medium nib was much smoother. I wouldn't call it glassy smooth, but I didn't really feel any feedback. It was, I guess you would call this more of a velvety smoothness, or you can feel the ink between the paper and the nib. Next, I've got a Pilot Lucina. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Now this nib puts down a decent amount of ink like the two medium nibs, and where I could feel the wetness of the two medium nibs, this felt a little dry. It wasn't scratchy, it wasn't unpleasant. It had more of a chalky feeling. And maybe that's just because I can really hear the nib on the paper. Next, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. A little bit dry, but surprisingly, I couldn't tell that when writing. It was very velvety smooth, buttery smooth on the paper. While this dries, I'll take a look at the other writing samples. Writing with the glass dip nib was very enjoyable on this Rhodia paper, and I was so surprised when I made the swatch with my tweezers. Look how crisp that is, but also look how uniform it is. It just put down the ink so uniformly, except for the little drip at the end, which is common for almost all inks. But again, this was all just so pleasant. The Platinum Fine was the only one that was okay because there was so much feedback. The Sailor Medium nib had a notable amount of feedback, but it was pleasant to write with. Again, I was so surprised by how smooth that Kakuno was, and I really liked the Sailor Lakul also. On my copy paper, most of these broader nibs, well, actually even the Pilot Gold Fine nib, just felt a little too wet. Like they were putting down enough ink that you would have like those darker blobs at the end of the pen stroke. The Sailor 1911, I put at first that it felt dry, but then I was like, no, it doesn't really feel dry. It feels really feedbacky and a little too wet. Now, the Platinum felt a little too scratchy, but the Explorer, the Lakul, and the Kakuno just felt really nice on this poor quality paper. The writing sample that I did in my Leuchtturm bullet journal was just felt so velvety smooth. Now, I don't know if you can see it in this lighting. There's some very subtle shading, and you can see just hints of that red halo in the heaviest bits of the letters. So, has some nice character and was very enjoyable to write with. Green is probably my favorite overall fountain pen ink color, and so I've tried lots of different shades, and I really want to like this bright grassy green, but usually when I end up getting it in a pen, I don't use it as much as I thought I would, but this Shin Ryoku is dark enough in a fine nib that I really find that I like it. It's a little more blue, and it looks a lot more blue here than Aurora Green. Aurora Green seems a little more true green, where, I don't know, when you look at the swatch, they're not all that much different. They both have a little bit of that red sheen in the heavier bits. Now, Herbon Lierre Sauvage is kind of a grassy green, but you can see a little more of the yellow in it. Kaweco Palm Green is a similar green, but it can get much darker in the heavier bits. It doesn't have quite as much blue in it, but just at first glance, they look very similar. Lamy Peridot is similar, but again, it can get much darker, and it's got a bit more blue in it. Shin Ryoku and California Teal are pretty similar. California Teal might have just a bit more blue in it. Monteverde Yosemite Green is very similar. Now, I found that I tend to prefer the greens that lean a little more gray, the more sagey greens, like Diatramentis Jane Austen, Diamine Green Black, and Jacquerbin Verde Atlantide. I tend to not like the very pale lime greens like Chicorin, and Alt Goldgrün is a pretty ink, but I just don't find myself using it much. Sailor Mano Ukikuza, I believe it was a little bit too dry. But the olive yellowish greens that I do kind of like were Monteverde Olivine, Private Reserve Avocado. One of my favorites is Sailor Tokiwa Matsu. Now this looks like a warmer green. It looks like it has a lot of yellow in it, but surprisingly, it had a very similar water-resistant blue component. Tasha Uguisu is kind of a paler green, but I did like it. It was nice and flowy in the nib, very smooth. And Venta Carlos was kind of a combination of my darker greens that I like, plus has a little more yellow in it. Looking at these darker greens really makes Shin Ryoku look a lot more brighter than it does when just looking at it by itself. I did a writing sample on a small piece of rhodia paper and submerged it in water for 10 minutes, and there was a very legible blue component that had some water resistance that was left behind. Sailor Tokiwa Matsu has a similar blue component that is left behind. But I found that my favorite green inks tend to have this darker black or gray component left behind, like Palm Green and Jacquerbin Verde Atlantide have this darker component, even though you can't really see it in the original ink. Okay, green inks that lean a little more toward the blue side haven't always been my favorite, but I have found that using this ink, just feeling how well it performs, has kind of won me over a little bit to this color. I still prefer it in the finer nibs because appearance-wise appears a little bit darker, but the performance of this ink is kind of changing my bias against this color. There was no bleed through, even on the heavier bits of the swatches. And I just really like the character of this ink. Now, with my lighting, I don't know if it will come across, but there's just little hints of shading that the shading's not just hitting you over the head. It's very subtle, and it just comes across as being interesting. This is definitely one of my favorite green inks now. This ink was a joy to write with, and after my first couple writing samples that I did, I knew that this ink was a winner because I was looking forward to trying it on other papers. I've done some writing samples recently with inks that I kind of dreaded doing my writing samples because it just wasn't enjoyable, but this was the complete opposite. This was a very pleasant ink to write with in almost all of the nibs. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.